Welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. This is episode 19, and in this episode, we're joined by a very special guest, Mark Johnson, the author of Spitting in the Soup, Inside the Dirty Game of Doping in Sports. And that's a bit of a provocative title. Here, I'll put it up there if you're watching. But it's actually a very historical work and a very thorough work, in my opinion. It's about 400 pages, and it gives a framework for this topic of doping in sport. I think when you read a memoir or a speech, or you read depositions, or anything of the nature of that, of discussing doping in sport, I think it's beneficial to have a sort of a historical context for that question or that situation, even if it's within a specific sport. Having some sort of context for that discussion, some sort of historical context for that discussion, I think is valuable. And that's why I reached out to Mark to have him on. I read the book. I thought it was fantastic. And I'll talk a little bit about him here. This is just kind of the inside the cover thing. But we discuss a little bit about certain topics in the book and certain topics, in today's current environment and that kind of thing, and, sort of provide some context there. But again, Mark Johnson's the author. And I'll read the inside of the cover. I'm just going to read it. It's Mark Johnson's covered cycling as a writer and photographer since 1980s. His work often focuses on the business of pro cycling, a topic that frequently intersects sport and that sport's history and of doping. His works appeared on Velo News, Road in the United States, Cycling Weekly in the United Kingdom, Velo in France, Ride, Cycling Review, and Cycling News in Australia, as well as general interest publications, including the Wall Street Journal. His first book, Argyle Armada, was a behind-the-scenes look at Garmin Pro Cycling Team. Mark is a Category 2 racing cyclist, has bicycled across the United States twice, and has competed in an Ironman triathlon. He's a graduate of the University of California, San Diego, has an MA and PhD in English literature from Boston University. His other passions include surfing, which you'll see in the interview based on his background, which he does frequently at his home that he shares with his wife and two sons in Del Mar, California. So without further ado, I'm going to send you over there. It was a great conversation. It was really, fantastic for me. I was kind of like a kid in a candy store, picking his brain on this stuff that he's spent so much time researching. So I hope you all enjoy. Thank you. Alrighty, so I'm joined here by Mark Johnson, the author of Spitting in the Soup. This book here, a fantastic book, a must-read on kind of framing up the question of doping in sport, which is sometimes a little more complex than a lot of people want to make it. And I'll just kind of start off with this. One thing that I found really fascinating, and the book kind of opens up with this, is this idea that one of the factors contributing to doping being frowned upon before the turn of the century was that potentially, sort of pushing that hard in sport was viewed as something that the working class would do, or viewed as something that, if you pushed really hard in sport, got too competitive, took drugs, you could kind of move up the ladder, and the old sort of landowning classes viewed that negatively, and that was potentially one of the areas where this sort of negative feeling towards doping was born, even as it's applied to something as competitive as sports. Is that kind of accurate, or do you want to expand on that a little bit there?
Yeah, sure. And thanks so much for having me on. So yeah, and to understand that is really, you have to understand that up until 1988, when the Olympic Games invited professionals, the Olympics was about amateurism, even though, particularly throughout the Cold War, that was really a sham, because particularly the athletes from Eastern European countries and the Soviet bloc, they were professionals, but they were pretending to be amateurs. But at the beginning of the Olympics, and the Olympics started in the 1890s, it was the domain of amateurs. And even for the Olympic founders, who were aristocrats, landowning aristocrats, even the notion of training was frowned upon because that was something that professionals did. So it wasn't so much the act of taking cocaine, or after it was first synthesized in the 1920s, amphetamines in order to increase performance, it was frowned upon. It was the fact that doing that is what professionals did, because professionals were expected to turn to pharmaceuticals, and don't look at them so much as pharmaceuticals, but as just as technical advantages and developments that athletes turn to naturally, pros, in order to apply their trade at a higher level. So taking drugs inherently wasn't evil. It was taking drugs was inherently professional. And that's what the Olympic founders didn't like about using drugs in sport. But as far as the pros were concerned, whether you were particularly a professional cycling, because cycling really started as a sport where people raced to make money. And it was expected, particularly because the early bike races were so grueling, that athletes had to take stimulants more than anything in order to do it. You know, original 6-day races, riders literally rode around a velodrome for 6 days. So doing that for 6 days without using cocaine or later amphetamines was just inhumane, that you would be expected to do that without any sort of stimulant.
I think Jean Anquetil, who won the tour like 5 times in the 50s, yeah, had a quote something like that. Like, this is inhumane that you guys would want us to do this type of a race without the help of drugs. Right. Early in the tour, when it was such a grueling test of endurance, sort of.
Yeah, and France and Belgium were the first countries to ban doping in sport in 1965. And France in particular banned doping because they saw the fact that cyclists had to take drugs to do their job as a violation of workers' rights. So essentially the team managers, the organizers of the Tour de France, the sponsors were expecting riders to assume this task that was impossible without drugs. And so since the riders couldn't defend themselves and say no, then the French government came in and said, look, we are going to make this practice illegal so that riders are no longer placed in this untenable situation where they have to take drugs, even though personally they may not want to. So clamping down on drugs was really seen as an issue of protecting workers' rights. Now, the athletes weren't on board with that. They, as far as they were concerned, they said, look, we've been doing this for decades. Since the 1870s, relatively few people are being harmed or dying, even fewer are dying from it. Just let us act as professionals like we always have and keep the government out of our business.
Yeah. And do you think, I have a note down here that like you said, running and cycling and those kinds of things really have their roots from the very beginning in this sort of, I guess, more working class kind of do the sport to make money kind of an environment. And I guess we always kind of think of sports like that being really susceptible to doping, potentially because of their, I guess, rigorousness or, the kind of, toughness and endurance factor of it. But do you think that some of the reason for doping being, kind of this constant problem in those sports is maybe that fact that it did originate with the working class, whereas something like, auto racing, we don't think of it as much because it really did have its roots in that sort of gentleman driver class. And, if someone, does something to, increase the plasma in their blood for a hot, Formula One race, we don't really discuss it or think about it. Yeah. Do you think some of the origins of those sports have an effect on the way we look at that?
To some degree, yes. But the minute that two humans start to compete in anything, and it metastasizes into a bigger social and sporting phenomenon, athletes are always going to look to technological advances in order to win. And so drugs has always been part of that. And it's, it really wasn't until the 1960s that using pharmaceuticals sort of became a demonic, less than moral act. Up until then, it was just seen as sports therapy. And that carried on even until the 1980s, because blood doping, so that's the act where you take your own blood out, store it in the refrigeration, and then reintroduce it into your body, which has the same effect as living at altitude or taking EPO. It basically gives you more red blood cells so you can go longer and faster and harder. That wasn't banned until 1985, after the 1984 Summer Olympic Games, where there was a scandal where the U.S. cycling team, some of the members of the team were blood doping. That was a perfectly legal act, and it was seen, and you see it, the attitudes toward it changed, because up until then in textbooks, blood doping was seen as just a form of sports therapy, a way to help athletes recover from hard workouts. And then after it became a scandal at the 84 Olympics and the IOC banned it, then that sports therapy moved from chapters on recovery into chapters on doping. Even though the act itself hadn't become any danger, there was no more research on it. It was just public and sporting opinion had changed.
Wow. So does it always go that way? Do in history have certain therapies or practices always, kind of first been allowed and then gotten disallowed? Or are there examples of something where there was some type of therapy or practice that was disallowed that then was revisited and viewed as healthy or admirable or something like that?
I mean, that's generally the case. So anabolic steroids, for instance, when weightlifters first started using anabolic steroids in the 1950s, it was seen as a very promising drug. And in fact, the American physician who started to experiment with anabolic steroids, he was a weightlifter who worked with the U.S. Olympic team and saw it as a potentially a miracle drug that could help athletes recover faster. But then what happened is that weightlifters and bodybuilders started to abuse it. And that is a very dangerous drug if it's abused. And so essentially what happens is, if you have a drug that can make an exceptional difference in your performance, then athletes say, well, if a little bit is good, then 5 times as much must be better. And when it comes to something like anabolic steroids, that's potentially very dangerous, if not lethal.
Sure.
But, and then it can also go backwards. So for instance, as marijuana is legalized by more countries and more states, the World Anti-Doping Agency, today, marijuana is a banned substance. Even though I would challenge you to find evidence that marijuana enhances the performance of any athlete. Robin Williams said famously that the only way that marijuana would enhance performance is if swimmers smoked it before their event and you put a Snickers bar on the other end of the pool. But it's still banned, really for moral reasons than reasons of health and health preservation. So that's a debate that's ongoing is should marijuana be removed from the banned substance list, particularly as it becomes legal in more and more parts of the world. So yeah, it can go the other way as well.
Yeah. And I noticed that, even early on, there was kind of a difference in the way that these sort of mechanical cheating or, cheating by cutting the course was viewed versus some of these pharmaceuticals. And I know you see it in cycling where there's obviously a huge doping history. And, people go back and forth and say, oh, this era was a bad era. This was a good era. We did what we had to do. There's a whole debate there. But there's really no debate when it comes to, if someone were to put a motor in their bike, like and I'll just say his name, all the stuff around Cancellara and 09 and 10, the people were talking and they say, oh, no, it's the bearings, it's the whatever. But no one would defend that. No athlete's going to come out and say, well, that's okay. Or if a a runner's running a marathon and they hitch a ride, in a car for 10 miles. It's not the same. And, people, I think many times people give, they say, oh, this drug is cheating or that drug is cheating. But when you bring up something like the mechanical doping or cutting the course, it's a whole different feeling. And even, sort of from the very beginning, that was the case. Is that something you see in the discussions about drugs and about doping, that there seems to be a kind of a big line in the way that someone talks about cheating with pharmaceuticals and the way someone talks about cheating with, say, cutting the course or something like that?
Well, there used to be, not so much anymore. So, I open up Spitting in the Soup with a story of the 1904 Olympic Marathon, which was in St. Louis, Missouri. And the runner who won, British American named Thomas Hicks, he used strychnine and alcohol. So we think strychnine, isn't that what you used to kill rats for? Mm-hmm. Yes, but in small doses, it's also a stimulant. And so in the official Olympic write-up, his physician describes administering strychnine and raw eggs to the eventual winner openly, because again, it wasn't banned. It was just seen as embracing technology. But somebody actually finished the marathon before Hicks, and he had gotten a ride in a car, so he cheated. So afterwards, he was roundly excoriated, lost his gold medal, and the guy who doped won and was celebrated. But today, really beginning in the 1960s, in tandem with larger social anxieties about recreational drug use and pot smoking hippies, then drugs, became categorically demonized in the same way that using mechanical cheating, whether it be riding in a car to shorten a race course or cutting the course or using a motor in your bicycle, they're really seen as both categorically wrong. And from the perspective of athletes who don't want to take drugs because it's illegal and because it's potentially healthy, I think that they would argue, and that's the way it should be. Anybody who's caught taking drugs, they're banned, then they shouldn't win and they should be thrown out of the sport.
Yeah. And do you think that there's kind of a, when we look at almost from this like moral perspective of doping and how it's changed over time, is it, even in the current time, is it different based on, where people are sort of socioeconomically or where they are in whichever country they live in? I know I heard Dina Castor referring to, when Molly Huddle broke her half marathon record, she said, and I feel like it's great because I know she's clean, but, if someone else is running and they just want to win the race and then they can, buy a farm and support their family for the rest of their life and they dope to do it, am I mean, this was her saying this, like, am I to, I think it's unfortunate, but am I to judge that? Maybe I would do the same thing in that case, so maybe there's kind of almost a difference between the way someone views it who came up through the university system in the US versus somebody, in a camp in rural Africa or something. Maybe they view it differently.
Yeah. You could say that there's, depending on your level of desperation, maybe there's a greater incentive to take those shortcuts. But on the flip side of that, there's a lot of research into masters bike racing and masters triathlon. So these are people, affluent first world people who are in their 40s and 50s and 60s and become completely entranced and dedicated to a sport like cycling. And they're taking drugs too.
Yeah. Just
because they want to be the alpha dog who's dropping everybody on the training ride or winning the local criterion.
Well, yeah. And
there's no financial benefit to that. It's pure ego.
Yeah. And it's the same as the local guy at the gym, taking all kinds of steroids just to look a little better at the gym,
So, the economics is a factor, but I don't think it's the one defining factor because I think it's a rather facile argument to say, well, if only we took the money out of sports, people wouldn't dope. That's not the case at all.
Yeah.
And there's also some other pretty fascinating research that has looked at athletes and what their motivations are to dope and what their fears are about doping. And what one research paper found was that as athletes get to higher and higher levels of professionalism, they are less incentivized to dope because they stand so much to lose so much.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Career, their income.
Yeah.
I mean, Lance Armstrong lost millions and millions of dollars. Whereas for the amateur who's up and coming, whether he's in France or the US and he wants to break into the pro peloton, if he can dope and win some big races, there's a lot of upside, but there's relatively little risk because there's so little testing that takes place in the amateur.
Yeah, you kind of lock yourself in. You have this past result you can ride, to some degree up the chain. Yeah. Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and you see, in the collegiate system, for instance, there's, at least back when I was in it, in the kind of like late 2010, 9, 10, 11, testing was very few and far between. I mean, you would kind of hear about it happening sometime, somewhere. But yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and that's another reason why it's, World Anti-Doping Agency, their own research has indicated that they're probably only catching 1 to 3% of the people who are doping. And it's why? Well, because it's very difficult. I mean, and to run a surveillance state where you're actually surveilling every Olympic athlete in the world 24 hours a day. I mean, it's very expensive. And B, you start to encounter a lot of human rights issues. I mean, just because you are an Olympic athlete, does that mean you sacrifice all rights to privacy? And should all athletes be assumed guilty until proven innocent? And so that's one of the reasons you can't catch everybody who dopes, or even you're only catching a small minority.
Yeah.
And as a public policy issue too, I talk about this in the book, what obligation do governments have? Because evidence suggests that when the police get involved with cracking it down on doping, that's when athletes tend to get serious about not doping, because the fear of jail is quite powerful. But then to ask a government, we want you to commit resources, money and medical resources and scientific resources to cracking down on doping.
Down the heroes and get them.
It's not high on the list of issues. I mean, there's your government policymakers. They say, well, no, our real issues are clean water, pollution, housing. There are much medical care. There are much bigger issues than spending your money trying to crack down on doping athletes.
Oh yeah. Well, and even in some of the policies, I know something that's coming up nowadays a fair amount is, you see it with these whereabouts violations, and then what happens is we don't know what happened. Someone says, oh, I was there. Someone says, oh, I got a call. I didn't get a call. And it's like, do you have some sort of like GPS system to make sure that the tester was there at the exact time? And, I know in the past, you heard stories from, the sort of era gone by in cycling where they would say, to sort of get away from the testers or the whereabouts violation, they would just say they're training in some secluded place, and the tester's not going to go there to get one guy. He'll go to Monaco or something where there's 50 cyclists training. Yeah, and it's funny too, because when you talk about percentage of catches, almost you hear about all these negative tests that people have. When the biological passport first came really to the scene, it was viewed as unbeatable. And then, Bernard Cole, who rode for Jero Steiner, he came out and said, after he tested positive, he retired and said, basically, we used the biological passport as feedback to microdose. Basically, we got our results and we kept within our lines, and that's what we did. And then, but you sort of see, and I honestly don't know if it's changed or gotten better, but you see, a lot of sports are using that as sort of the shield that there is no blood doping going on based on this test. But, most likely there's a lot getting through the cracks.
Yeah. And I mean, cycling will never be completely clean, but I think it has gotten better. And that a lot of that could be attributed to cultural expectations in the peloton itself. I think that amongst the riders, they frown upon doping, and fewer teams expect, either expressly or implicitly, that the riders are going to dope in order to win. Maybe that's because there's a lot of publicity damage that comes when these teams get busted. The sponsors don't want to be involved with these scandals. The riders don't want to dope. It's expensive. You got to sneak around all the time. It's potentially dangerous, if you're blood doping and you're injecting your blood in less than sanitary situations, or the blood isn't stored at the right temperature. So there's a lot of complications. And I would say that in general, the athletes don't want to have to do it. It's not like they're jumping up and down saying, yeah, let's dope so we can go faster.
Sure.
I think that's a positive shift over the last few decades.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But for every shift like that, then, you see what's the doping scandal that happened in with the Sochi Olympics, where you have Russia instructing their athletes, and this is coming from the top down, the highest level of government, saying, look, you need to dope and you will dope in order to glorify the state.
And we'll aid you in the process.
Yeah. And we're going to aid you by falsifying your positives when you test positive, destroying the positives and swapping them out with clean samples. There, the athletes are in a really tough situation, because even if they don't want to dope, they have to, because that's the mandate of the state. And in a place like Russia or autocratic states, the individual rights and an individual's volition is always secondary to the glorification of state. So that's a tough one, and it continues to carry on.
Oh yeah. So you talked about the Olympics sort of beginning as this, explicitly beginning as this call to amateurism, mm-hmm. and kind of this class distinction and that kind of stuff. And we saw sort of around the emergence of Nike and Prefontaine and some of that in that era, where the athletes were really struggling to maintain amateurism, and in some ways, like in the NCAA, the amateurism kind of got its tentacles out into other areas of making money, to the point where Prefontaine couldn't go help sell shoes at the shoe store because it would lose his amateurism, and he had to kind of live in a trailer to be able to compete for that medal. And then we saw kind of around was it the 84 Olympics? Was that the first Olympics where professionals were allowed?
Well, professionals were first allowed in 88 in Seoul.
Okay.
But 84 Olympics that was when the International Olympic Committee, which is based in Switzerland, who up until 84, that was their battle, was maintaining this fortress around amateurism. But in 1984, due to a quirk in electoral politics in California, in 1978, the citizens of Los Angeles passed a referendum that made it illegal to use taxpayer money to fund the 84 Olympics. Now, the IOC in Switzerland was horrified, because the way the IOC works is they go into different cities and asked for bribes, and the city that bribes the IOC with the highest number of dollars and highest benefits gets the Olympic Games. Well, the citizens of LA said, we're not on board with this. It's not going to happen. In fact, we're going to make sure it isn't, because if you spend any taxpayer dollars, you're going to jail. And so in preparation for the 84 Olympics, a guy named Peter Uberoth, who had made a fortune in the travel industry, organized the games. And at the end of the games, the games came out over $280 million in the black. They made money. And how did he do that? Well, first of all, by charging high fees for television rights, and also by charging a lot of money for fewer but bigger corporate sponsors. And at first, when the IOC saw what he was doing, they were horrified because it was so contrary to the spirit of amateurism. But at the end, when they saw how much money he had made, they were really won over to this. So that sort of busted down the door, and professionalism, the Olympics became a theater for professionalism. And
yeah, because sort of leading up to that, a lot of the Olympic cities were left in real, almost financial ruin.
So the 76 Olympic Games were in Montreal, and it ended up costing just astronomical hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars more than the citizens of Quebec were sold. And so the LA knew this, and the voters in LA knew this, that they were going to get screwed with the Olympic Games coming to LA. And so that's why they said no. And the IOC had to go along with it because they didn't have any other options. There were no other cities that were available to host the games. And also the IOC they were desperate for the games to go on because in 80, the US had boycotted the games, which were in Russia that year. And so the IOC really wanted the games to happen without a lot of scandal in 84. Well, Soviet Union ended up boycotting the 84 games anyways. That's a whole nother story, is how the Cold War really fostered doping.
The level of terrorism as being a massive fear daily with putting on these events. I know that even in the 84 Olympics, that was one of their biggest worries, was the daily, threat of terrorism with all that was going on in the world. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. So did that change to larger corporate sponsors and professional athletes have any effect on, the testing did the IOC themselves do testing, or was it through a different agency? And did that have any effect on the, sort of amount of testing or the way that it was viewed?
Yes, the IOC did the testing, and the rise of these giant corporate sponsors did have an effect in that the IOC took steps to make sure that all the positive tests were buried because they didn't want scandal. So at the 84 Olympics in Los Angeles, the track and field events were at the end of the games because they bring in the most television viewers. And the testing lab was at UCLA. And the guy who was running the tests, he had all these positives coming across Don Caitlin is his name. He had all these positives coming across his test bench. He went to the head of the medical commission for the IOC, a guy named Alexander de Merode, and said, all right, here's the numbers, because when you're tested, your blood or your urine, your name isn't on the test tube, it's just a number. So say number 673 is positive. He went back to de Merode and said, look, all right, I need the spreadsheet that shows whose name this number corresponds to.
It vanished.
It had vanished. It went missing. Yeah. So at the end, there was I want to say 14 American athletes who were positive but still got their medals. So yeah, it was, and both the IOC and the LA Olympic organizers, they complained about how intrusive these drug testers were getting and how it was basically going to ruin some very successful games. So it was really an issue of, we've got big money on the line. These corporate sponsors are underwriting the Olympics because they want to be associated with all that's good and great about the Olympics: youth, courage, dedication, success. But cheating and using drugs to accomplish all the above are not part of your corporate marketing campaign. And so really there was a lot of pressure to keep the doping scandals under the table. And that carried on until 1999, when the World Anti-Doping Agency was created, which was a truly independent doping agency that the IOC didn't want. The IOC wanted to keep, the International Olympic Committee wanted to keep doping under its own umbrella so it could control the story.
Sure.
But thanks to the Festina affair, which was a big doping scandal with the 98 Tour de France, and also a big bribery scandal for the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, IOC didn't have much credibility, so their efforts to keep anti-doping under their own roof didn't go anywhere. And so a truly independent anti-doping agency, the World Anti-Doping Agency, was created in late 1999.
Yeah, and that seems like a very important thing, because if the league or the team or the event is monitoring doing the testing to sort of maintain this fair playing field, and a star or someone, a former winner or whatever, tests positive, that they're not going to be incentivized to get that out. And
no, so the fox is guarding the hen house for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now this may come across as I'm justifying doping. I'm not. But the goal of professional sports is not to be a church and to create a more moral and just society. The purpose of professional sports, and this includes the Olympic Games, is to entertain people and make money. End of story. But those two goals have been conflated with this almost evangelical need to try and purify athletes, in not only in their bodies by keeping drugs out of them, but also their souls. Because in the 1960s, as anti-doping agencies grew with power and stature, the act of doping became synonymous with moral corruption. And that was a relatively new phenomenon. And even the doctors would express the need to watch out for the moral health of the athletes as well as their physical health. And this was a profound change, because up till this point, sports medicine doctors and trainers were really seen as technicians. Their job was to keep athletes safe, administer the drugs in safe manners under a doctor's supervision. And that really changed in the 1960s, and the entire act of doping was demonized, and it really gained a much darker hue.
And do you think, does that view stem from the sort of turn of the century creation of the Olympics, and those same ideas kind of flowing through, and then these anti-doping agencies were sort of looking for, a little bit of a power grab or something like that, and they sort of played on those types of ideas?
Yeah, I mean, you could say the quest for moral purity that was originally the raison d'etre of amateurism was supplanted by anti-doping. And the amateurism, as with the original Olympic Games, were really seen as a form of sort of it was a prophylaxis against the mixing of economic levels.
Sure. Yeah.
The Olympic Games were for amateurs, and it was really a sort of feudal view of the world where power and honor and wealth are handed down from God to king to the blessed aristocrats. And that's what amateurism was. It was a celebration of those chosen people who in that worldview were also morally and ethically superior to the people who had to go work in the mines or work in a bar or a restaurant.
Sure.
And so that quest for ethical and moral purity that the Olympic Games were first built around sort of was translated into this anti-doping mission to also preserve the moral and ethical purity of these athletes.
And then laid across the professional landscape.
Yeah. Even though professionalism has nothing to do with that, it has to do with making money and entertaining people.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's one of the basic constant struggles with the whole thing, and sort of why it's most likely going to be an ongoing sort of issue per se, like you mentioned, is that, you know, the sport and the event and everything is, you know, you get into the sport to run as fast as you can, or to, you know, whatever. And, you know, someone watching in the stands, if they could sort of be assured that there was no doping, they would rather see, you know, somebody win a 5K in, you know, 12:40 rather than 13:40. And so there's this desire to see amazing entertainment, to watch really, you know, sort of intense competition, and then but almost like this wave of amateurism has been blown across it to say, you know, but within certain bounds, and then everybody in the audience says yes, but within certain bounds. You know, it's kind of an odd,
right. And what fans say and what fans do are often two different things. I mean, I think that one good example of that is in the 90s, there was a baseball strike. Baseball stadium sat empty for over 300 days. Baseball finally came back. Fans were pretty disgusted, both with the players and the owners, because they just saw it as a pissing match between billionaires and millionaires. And so they had no sympathy for either of them. But then you've got Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa firing up this massive home run battle. You see these guys on the field, they're blown up like Popeye from drugs. Everybody knew it, but fans
blown up by Popeye. That's great for the Wheaties boxes and you know, the American Express commercials and all of that as well.
Yeah, so we may not have liked the fact that these guys were doped, but man, we sure were filling baseball stadiums. And so yeah, what fans do and what they say and what they do is not always the same. We just want to be entertained.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's you see it in cycling with the old, you know, kind of quote unquote heroics that we now find out were these, you know, incredibly, you know, dope performances. People still go back and watch them. People still go back and talk about them.
Yeah.
You know, so there's a desire to see them, and you would say, well, I hope it's clean, but you know, I'd prefer to watch that instead of, you know, something, you know, more tactical or something like that.
Right. And whether they're doped or not, I mean, this is unfortunate for the riders who do want to race clean and don't want to have to deal with the complications, ethical and financial and health-wise, that come with doping. Fans are going to watch whether or not the riders are doped, because the Tour de France is still one of the most beautiful, thrilling spectacles on earth. And there's nothing like those 3 weeks in the summertime when it's on at 5 a.m. in the US and you get up excited to watch it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I kind of hit all the main sort of questions that I had. Is there anything else you'd like to add or kind of throw in, or?
I think just what I hope readers really get out of the book is a more thorough understanding that the story of doping in sport isn't just about, it's and not just a matter of a couple of corrupt athletes who are looking to take shortcuts versus a bunch of pure athletes. It's much more complex than that, because there's issues of international politics. Particularly, I have several chapters on the Cold War, because the Cold War is probably the biggest driver of sophisticated doping in sport that we've ever seen.
Interesting.
And that was driven not by individual athletes doping, but by nation states trying to one up each other on the global stage. So those are very complex. And then you've got the issue of economics. There's a lot of economic forces that want to keep doping scandals under the table. So while the sports organizers and sponsors may say that they're against doping in sport, then that may be true. They're more interested in minimizing doping scandals. And then the third part is the desire of individual athletes to excel and embrace the technology that's there. So it's much more complicated than just, wolves and sheep.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Of course. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. I would encourage anybody, go buy this book, read this book. It is really good. Like you said, it puts a great framing. I've read probably every memoir that's, come out in running and cycling and that kind of stuff. And I was an athlete myself. But I think this book really does a lot for the paradigm and for kind of shaping up a framework to look at the question. So I think it's a really important book, and I'm glad that you wrote it, and I really appreciate you coming on to discuss it today.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.